Hello everyone and welcome back to a special edition of Foreign Fridays. Today we are discussing the documentary Bobi Wine, the People's President, which is currently airing on Hulu and Disney+. What at first seems like a look into one man's life ends up being a front row seat into a revolution. This is a compelling piece of work and really a testament to documentary filmmaking. I was invested in Bobi, his family, and also the people of Uganda. And I was impressed by how the film kept me on the edge of my seat. Like at first I'm just rooting for Bobi to win, but by the end of it, I'm just praying that this man makes it out alive. The filmmakers took enormous risks trying to capture the uprising in Uganda. This film is entirely self-funded. And just to give you some perspective, the director of photography, Moses Bayo, was actually shot in the face and in prison while making this film. So it took about 2 years to edit, and it doesn't even include the most horrific acts of violence that they filmed, nor does it include the numerous interviews with individuals who were tortured by the government. But I think what the documentary ends up doing very well is not only capturing the violence on the ground, but also capturing the spirit of a people who are very much ready for change. The documentary begins with some background information about a man named Robert Kyagulanyi, known professionally as Bobi Wine. He was born in the slums of Kampala, and growing up he dreamed of having a decent life, a nice house, a nice car, and he was actually a very popular musician. And his music was, about girls, about being famous. He was really popping at that time, and his life took a turn when he met his wife, Barbara, and he started to sing about the political situation in Uganda. And so this not only resonated with his fans, but it introduced him to new fans, right? His fan base grew because they could really connect with his story, and they could really connect with a lot of the things that he was singing about. So what I was impressed by is how the documentary weaves in Bobi's music, and it's not to plug his music, it's more to demonstrate that there is power in numbers, right? It's not just his songs, but it's about what he was saying. A lot more people were ready for a change than the government might have you believe. Bobi is an incredibly charismatic figure. Him and his wife, Barbie, really display such a level of vulnerability. I didn't get the sense that they were pretending to be something that they were not. I didn't sense that this was a performance, and it really felt like the filmmakers had free reign. You actually forget that the camera is there. And in an interview, the filmmakers actually make this point. They expected to discover some discrepancy between the things Bobi was saying and the things that he was doing, but it never really materialized. So the more popular Bobi became and the less corruptible he seemed, the more danger he was in and the more danger the people around him were in. Bobi's opponent is a man named Yoweri Museveni. He is a 79-year-old who has been ruling the country of Uganda for 37 years. His reign has turned Uganda's once promising democracy into a total dictatorship. And his wife is the Minister of Education and Sports. His brother is an influential businessman and serves as an advisor in the military. His son-in-law is also a presidential advisor and apparently harbors his own political ambitions. Eldest son is in the military and is also special advisor to the president. And the people of Uganda have a very complicated relationship when it comes to President Museveni. Some people love him, some people hate him, but even the people who love him used to hate him, and this is a point articulated by Bobi in the documentary. In fact, Bobi's political idol was Museveni, and he says quite clearly, power corrupts absolutely. And if given the chance, he would ask Museveni, how did you fall so far? A lot of the things that Bobi is saying is not that far off from Museveni was saying when he was president early in his career. Just to give you some context, in 1980 he was quoted as saying, "Freedom of speech is a right of the people and not a favor from the government." And in that same year he even went on to say that leaders can turn into bad people, and if something falls in milk, you must not let it stay there, but remove it before the milk gets bad. We should be careful. We must not only praise ourselves but criticize ourselves too, or the movement fails. So Ugandans grew up with an image of President Museveni as a liberator, as a peace bringer, and actually Bobi Museveni comes from very humble beginnings. He was actually an ex-rebel, and he was partly responsible for overthrowing Idi Amin. And after a succession of very corrupt and violent leaders, like, he was a breath of fresh air. So at the start of his career, Museveni actually brought economic and political stability. He improved the infrastructure of the country, and for a while he did really support free press, and he implemented a lot of measures that successfully combated HIV/AIDS. However, the longer he stayed in power, the more corrupt his government became. Like, they garnered a reputation for basically suppressing opposition and dissenting voices. They say you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain, but in President Museveni's case, a total meme. Over time, he has cracked down on free press, removed presidential term limits as well as age limits, and with no plans to step down or name a clear successor, his decision to stay in power is a bit perplexing, given that early in his career, he would actually criticize leaders who overstayed their welcome. And even though he's won these elections multiple times, it's just clear that there's no validity to any of them, right? Like, these elections have become kind of a ritual to let people know that this is the ruling party, and you either fall in line or there are consequences, right? I imagine he doesn't want history repeating itself. Like, the way things are going, it seems like he will be overthrown like the leaders he overthrew before him, you know? So I imagine that's not how he wants to go out, but that just seems to be the direction that things are taking. The system he has put in place makes it ideal for leaders like Idi Amin or people who are very ruthless to rise to power and undo all the progress that Uganda has made thus far. So the rumor currently is that he is grooming his son Muhoozi to become his successor. However, his son is nearly 50 and has shown no signs that he is capable of leading a country. Unlike his father Museveni, Muhoozi comes from great privilege and great wealth. They say that with great power comes great responsibility, but in this case, no responsibility. Muhoozi has actually gone to some of the best schools around the world, but it seems like he's learned absolutely nothing. Like, in 1995, he was quoted as saying that Uganda will never have everlasting peace unless wealthy Ugandans rule the state. He even tweeted that the Ugandan army could capture the capital of Kenya, Nairobi, in 2 weeks. In addition to that, he offered a dowry of 100 cows to marry the Italian female prime minister. And to make matters even worse, he's voiced his opinion about the war in the Ukraine, saying that non-white people support the invasion of the Ukraine. And Museveni has not only scolded his son, but has had to actively apologize for his actions. And it's a bit embarrassing because Muhoozi's introduction into this world, into this, into politics, is his father apologizing for him, right? Like, Museveni has had to ask the Kenyan people for forgiveness. And he's made it clear that his son's opinions about the war in the Ukraine are his son's, right? It has nothing to do with the people of Uganda. And although he's encouraged his son to become a public figure, clearly this was a bad idea because his son is clearly just really entitled and really privileged. And as I said in the beginning, like, the people of Uganda have a very complicated relationship with Museveni, but they don't have a relationship to this man. So it would be curious to see if they would be willing to follow a man that's this unhinged. And again, Museveni has laid the groundwork to allow his family to take control. But the problem is there's no clear successor, there's no clear line. And so the only thing stopping this government from falling into chaos is, ironically, Museveni's presence. Like, the minute he's gone, it's over. Like, I imagine the level of infighting that's about to happen, all the internal conflicts, and then how that will bleed out into Uganda. I mean, this will not be good for anyone. What makes the documentary so special is that you can sense that there's like a change in the air. As I said, about 70 to 75% of the population is 35 or younger. Like, it's a very young population. And so there's a huge generational shift. Like, yes, people are afraid of their government. Yes, the situation on the ground is very scary. But again, people are more afraid of their future, right? They're not so easily discouraged. And I think social media has made it very difficult to take out a man like Bobi Wine. He has supporters all over the world, not just in Africa, not just in Uganda. And it's hard for the government to justify a lot of the actions that they're taking. And again, I can't believe, like, you know, with Museveni, like, he overthrew people that he's basically now becoming. Like, there's so much footage on social media. Ordinary citizens are capturing the violence on the streets. So it's hard for the government to justify a lot of the actions that they are taking. But it hasn't really deterred the government. Like, it's very clear that President Museveni will not step down. He has no interest in stepping down. Like, they have done everything in their power to discourage Bobi Wine. Like, he starts the documentary rallying, and by the end, the man can barely walk, right? Like, they've killed his supporters. They've incarcerated them. They've done everything they can to just force them out of the country. I'm really glad they captured the COVID time period. Like, the fact that the president was withholding resources from people who were in opposition to him or people he felt were against him, like, COVID regulations actually enabled a lot of, you know, coercive governments, is another documentary that needs to be made. But one thing is clear, right? Like, Museveni's win just clearly demonstrated that democracy is non-existent, right? Like, Bobi and his team did everything they could to follow the rules, but all attempts were totally just, they were destroyed, right? Like, their headquarters were raided, their funding was stolen. Anybody that attempted to campaign against them, like, the hotels were asked not to house them. Like, not only was the government discouraging opposition, but they were discouraging people from supporting the opposition, right? Like, they're like, the vibe you got is like, listen, if you go this way, we're taking names, right? Like, the government has become very, very unforgiving when it comes to dissent at this point, and there seems to be like a zero tolerance policy. So thankfully, Bobi and his family make it to election day. Unfortunately, he loses, but the days leading up to the election and even afterwards were absolute chaos. Like, they turned off the internet, and of course this was to account for any chaos that could come up. And they only turned the internet back on once Museveni was crowned as winner. And, you know, the president has done everything in his power to maintain control, but he can't really, like, there's only so much you can do when you're 79 years old. And at one point, like, he was asked this question, like, he's been asked this question repeatedly, why won't you step down? Like, you're kind of pushing it here, right? Like, not only is he not stepping down, he's not really, like, there's no successor. It seems like there's no plan beyond him. And I thought this was a very interesting quote. He says, "How can I go out of a banana plantation I have planted that has just started bearing fruit?" So Museveni's age, the corruption in the country, the lack of successor, and this incredibly young population is a recipe for disaster. Like, the idea that the country is now bearing fruit and he feels like, basically, I did all this work, why shouldn't I reap the rewards? But the problem is, this progress can go away within seconds. Like, the vibe the president is giving is, if I can't have you, nobody will, right? He's made it clear. He's like, this is my country, not our country. And I thought Bobi's decision, as well as his family's, to stay in Uganda, again, it's a generational shift. Like, they're kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't. And they're not giving up that easily, because at the end of the day, if they leave, there's no hope things will get better. But if they stay, there is a chance, right? There is a chance that things will improve. And people often marvel at how Africa, like, a lot of African countries are constantly in chaos. In the documentary, we see Bobi travel to different countries and we see him try to get support, but he doesn't really get the support that he wants. And the reality is, I think in part this documentary wants people to kind of question their own governments and their complicity in allowing governments like this to kind of exist and do all the things that they're doing. And one of the scenes that really struck out at me was just before Bobi was tortured and before, like, you know, things went from bad to worse. He makes a comment about the police. He says, you know, eventually they will be on our side, right? Like, these are people trying to make a living. These are people that, like, he really sympathizes with the police, even though we get so much footage of them just wreaking havoc on the streets. And I think Uganda's complicated relationship to their president Museveni makes it hard for the military and police to change sides. But once Museveni is gone, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And I thought, Bobi, the one thing that struck me about Bobi and the people of Uganda, which I think the movie does a good job of really drawing these parallels through his music, is the level of optimism. And it's no wonder he kind of became a symbol for change. So his name, Bobi Wine, is a nickname. And the implication being, of course, you get better over time. And despite all these setbacks, like, he is not discouraged, even though the situation seems to be getting very, very bad. And it looks like things will get a lot worse before they get better. However, whatever the outcome is or will be, Uganda will definitely come out stronger and a lot better by the end of this. And so I encourage all of you to watch this documentary, and shout out to the filmmakers. Like, they put themselves at great risk doing this, like, and you feel it watching this. You're like, wow, like you're kind of, they capture moments where you're like, how are you still alive? And so I think I was thoroughly impressed. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.